practice of their faith. But when it comes to government support for non-government schools, my party's got a much better set of propositions. I've been working very closely with the Catholic Education Commission, but the same goes for Maronite schools. We're going to put more money into education. We respect that some parents choose to send their children to get a faith-based education.
Right. Yes.
And I have a very clear view, have had my whole time in the Labor Party, that where parents choose to send their children to a faith-based education and they're paying taxes to Canberra, it is the reasonable expectation of these parents that some of that money they pay in taxes is reinvested in the schools they choose to send their kids to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that demonstrates, as you know, church attendances are down, that's still important, but the schools, that's how people keep in touch with their faith and their culture and their values. But we're very strong defenders.
How do you see the elections next year?
Competitive.
2 years time.
Sorry.
For the federal one. If it happens today.
If it happened today, we'd probably win.
Okay.
Yes.
We're competitive. The government's got its last roll of the dice with the budget.
Yes.
But there's a certain arrogance. They say they're going to be Santa Claus.
Mm.
Well, they're spending your money on you.
Mm.
That's not Santa Claus. That's just arrogant.
But the question here is, what are you going to do to ensure that this electorate, which feels like it's not always represented, their views aren't always represented, feel like Labor is listening? Because at the moment, there's obviously values that aren't aligned. So how do you...
Some values, and I don't see the community as homogenous either.
Exactly.
I think there's a bit of generational change even in the Lebanese Australian community. I think more younger Lebanese Australians would have had a different view to their own parents and grandparents, for example. But when it comes to the community and its contribution, I can think of 3 or 4 very simple propositions which put us head and shoulders, a whole length ahead of the other horses in the political race. 1, proper funding of schools. I've got no doubt that for this community, the schools are important. Sense of continuity and values-based education. It is a matter of record that we're willing to invest more money in education. So that's fine.
What about infrastructure? Because when it comes to immigration...
Let me answer your first question.
Schools.
Schools.
Yep.
And the reason why I'm dwelling on that is that my opponents talk a big game in education, but they don't play well on the field. And we can afford to say that we're going to fund schools, both government and non-government, more generously, because we're not giving the big tax cuts to the big companies. Second proposition is older members of the community returning to perhaps visit Lebanon, go back, some of your readers, to visit the Middle East. Say they've worked here their adult life, they're now on the age pension. My opposite number is saying that if you're overseas for longer than 6 weeks, you lose your pension.
Yeah.
We do not support that reduction.
It's not fair.
It's not fair. The older people, they might want to go back and see family. They don't have a lot of money. They're not making the trip every 2 months. So they save up their money. And they want to go for a decent amount of time, a couple of months. Well, if all of a sudden they've got to make a choice, do they visit their family or do they lose their pension? That's an unfair choice. So we do not support the reduction in the time period which, if you're overseas, you lose your pension. We want no change to the current rules.
Okay.
The government want to reduce it to 6 weeks.
What are the current rules?
It's 13.
Yeah, I think
13
that's
weeks?
right.
Yeah. 3
Okay.
months we think is okay.
And for a lot of Lebanese Australians who go to Lebanon in July and August, yeah, that's right, they'll be affected by this change.
Absolutely.
So
Can I add another one, Bill, which I know a lot of people in the community would be affected by? The government also want to change citizenship rules, so you can't become a citizen
that's right.
unless you've got university level English.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now think about how many people who read El-Telegraph, who are citizens and who vote at every election, who don't have university level English. What the government's doing is effectively saying, we don't think you should be a citizen. We don't think you should be able to vote in elections.
It's creating second class. And
Yes.
we don't, when Canberra levies taxes on people, we don't say you've got to have university level English to pay tax. So why all of a sudden are we introducing this standard? And the reality is that a lot of people come here with perhaps not university level English, but they bring a lot of other skills. Migrants, more likely to have small businesses, more likely to pay tax, you know.
Yeah.
So more likely to start businesses. So that's the third difference I was going to go to. So there's the pension cut-offs when you travel overseas. There's the citizenship. There is, of course, the proper funding for faith-based schools. The other proposition is aged care. You know, you look at the older members of the community. What we want to do is start expanding, giving the Lebanese community and other communities the ability to provide aged care in people's first language. When you get older, perhaps you are, you know, some of your facilities go, you tend to resort to your first language. And so we think it's about dignity in ageing. We think there's a contract this country has with its older citizens that, having supported the nation, it's reasonable to get some intelligent support, and it's actually cheaper in the long run. Because if people can't get appropriate care, then all that does is it clogs up the hospitals anyway, which costs more.
Yeah.
So there are four differences which we're well ahead. The fifth is one which goes to members of this community, which is, of course, healthcare costs in this country. You know, I don't think this community is different to a lot of others in that the two priorities, two most important things I would suggest about your readers, they worry about their family and they worry about their health.
Good.
Yeah, but let's put it from different angle. I mean, we all know that we live in a multicultural society, but at the meantime, you have the advantage and disadvantage of this social system. We see sometimes a tendency to creating some ghettos or not assimilating properly in the main society. That's why probably the Liberal Party or coalition have pushed this side to say, oh, well, you have to become an Australian, you have to accept our values, which they openly said many times. So what's your position as a Labour Party?
Of course, people who become Australian citizens should accept our laws and our values. We've got to leave some of the conflicts of the old world behind when you come here. But that, I don't see that it's a simple binary, that you've got to forget your past and your values and your heritage.
No, I don't mean that. Sometimes we hear calls like people asking for the change of system, of imposing Sharia law and, you know, issues like that.
No, we're not going to support that.
Yeah.
You know, that's
Okay.
No.
This is exactly what Pierre was saying.
no.
It's about the Western suburb problem that we.
This is what
And
I'm
the
saying.
problem is when refugees are brought in, they're often brought into areas where, you know, as you say, English proficiency isn't even at university level. So you have a lot of migrants or refugees in areas that are already highly populated without the right infrastructure. And you've got local mayors, like even the mayor of Bankstown, the mayor of Fairfield, always saying, like, okay, it's great, we're accepting, we understand that it's the same community, but there's already enough pressure with integrating into society. And when you put so many more people in those already, you know, I guess the metropolitan areas, but they're becoming so overpopulated.
There's no doubt that in Sydney in particular, but also parts of Melbourne, there's a sense that it's getting so, that the population growth is so significant that the infrastructure hasn't kept pace. But I see part of that challenge, it's not about permanent migration, it's about the fact that we use a lot of people on temporary visas in this country. We have 1.6 million people in Australia on a temporary visa, which gives them a work right. Now that doesn't help our young people get jobs. Also it means that we're not training people for the jobs of the future. This country should never have a skill shortage over a 4 or 5 year period. If there's a skill shortage in year one, there's no discipline at all, which you can't train someone for in 4 or 5 years. So I think part of the challenge with immigration is not relying on cheap overseas labour, but rather training our own.
And that's one of the gaps we've got here, because
Have we failed as a nation on the level of education, training, skill?
We failed, I think, on the level of technical training. We're sending a lot of people to university, but we're not educating enough tradespeople. The other thing is, as jobs change in the Australian economy, we're not retraining enough people. So that's why we want to put public TAFE back at the centre. Vocational education is as important as university education. My dad was a fitter and turner and then a seafarer. You know, not everyone has to go to university. The reality is that if you look at, say, the construction trades, riggers, dogmen, form workers, boiler makers, welders, they're all in their 50s. Or they're a temporary visa worker. So I think we've got to train a lot more people in our TAFE system.
this seat's about 20 kilometres from Turnbull Seat.
Okay.
And if you compare and contrast the two different areas, the unemployment rate here is triple what it is in Toombul C.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the average income is a third. And then if you have a look at the education information, you can understand why those figures are why they are. The number of kids finishing school, lower. The number of kids with a TAFE qualification, much lower. The number of people with a university degree in our area, much lower. So what we do in education is going to be critical for this area, sort of middle Sydney, your Parramatta's, your Strathfields, your Hurstville's, your Bankstowns. You know, people often talk about Western Sydney and they think about the airport, but there's big challenges here in the middle of Sydney, as well as particularly about education.
But let's go to perhaps the hard edge behind what you were both saying. I think people have always assumed that when people migrate to Australia, even if the parents don't learn the language as well as the kids who go to school, that every generation assimilates more. But there's no doubt in my mind that for a few very small numbers, and they're very small in overall proportion, but nonetheless they're significant, it's as if they've never left where they came from. And that whilst the kids might have gone to school, they come back straight into that sort of village life of where they came from, and that isn't as healthy. So we've always got to be doing our very best to encourage people to break out of just one monoculture and understand Australian life.
Just an interesting statistic from this neck of the woods to add to what Bill said. So the unemployment rate here is about 11%. The unemployment rate amongst people who've got English as a first language is 5%.
Yeah.
Unemployment rate amongst people who are born overseas and don't have good English is 25%.
Yeah.
So that there's a correlation. So English language training is important. I don't think we do it anywhere near good enough at the moment. We shouldn't be saying if your English isn't good enough, you can't be a citizen. But we've got to do a lot more in making sure that people get better English to integrate into our society and get a good job.
And that's where TAFE comes in. Technical training, it's the go. When a woman has a baby, she mightn't go back to her old job, but TAFE can give them new training options whilst they're raising the kids. So I think that.
But will your government help?
Yeah,
pay
we'll
for that,
invest
or-
in TAFE. Yes. Again, we can offer to pay for these things because we're not going to hand out the big tax cuts to the big end of town. These are hard decisions. If you want to have a big corporate tax cut, you're probably going to vote for the other fella.
Okay.
If you want to see investment in technical training,
Yeah.
you'll probably vote for us.
Can I ask you again about, because I didn't record that your opinion about personal freedom and religious freedom, especially after the legalization of gay marriage. And so many groups are a bit concerned about the level of freedom they might enjoy later on when issues are more stressed in the legal system.
Well, let me be absolutely clear that whilst I supported the change in the law, I did so on the basis that the way that a church conducts its own matters, in its own church or in its own hall which the church runs, the way that priests or lay people representing the church in terms of their church activities, unaffected. Unaffected.
Unaffected, yes. That's
Absolutely, and I'll fight for that.
Good.
I spent 13 years going through the Catholic education system. And again, my bona fide is about fighting for that. That's why I keep talking about education, is the defence we've made of properly funding poorer, non-government religious schools.
Yeah.
Because what you have heard, that once the same-sex marriage has become a law or an act there, so it's a must on the priest to marry them.
That's bullshit.
Okay, that's good.
That's a very direct
It's good.
answer.
It's good to hear that. It's good to highlight that because this is what others were saying at a certain stage.
Well, maybe people wanted to say that just to
Yeah.
engender a level of concern.
Mm.
It's not compulsory for the church to administer a marriage in that fashion.
Can I just ask off topic? Australia's relations with China at the moment are not the best because of the.
The intemperate language of the current government.
That's right. So, what's Labor's plan to? Well, firstly, how much do you value that relationship, and what is the plan to keep it strong?
You know those washing machines which operate on centrifugal, sort of operation. China's in the middle of the centrifuge. we're towards the end of the centrifuge or at the margin. But the faster the centrifuge goes, the faster our economy goes. That's the relationship. We are not disconnected. Physically, we may be an island, but China's growth has been good for Australia. Now, does that therefore mean that we should agree with everything China says or does? Of course not. America still remains the cornerstone of our security policy. But this argument that somehow we're either all the way with the Americans or all the way with the Chinese does not reflect Australia's national interest. We're not a superpower. We will never be a superpower. We must understand what we can do, and that means always thinking about where we need to go in the long term. One thing which I think even the harshest critics of China have to acknowledge is that the Chinese think long term. And I will say this without being overly partisan. We've got a government who thinks every 2 weeks, the news poll. You have China's thinking in terms of 50 years and 100 years. So there's a lesson there for us. So China's an important and valuable economic partner, but that doesn't mean that we have to change our values. We just have to think ahead. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Yeah, definitely. I mean, we live as you said, in their environment, the Pacific, which is part of the growing countries as population, as economy, as military power, and we still a bit lost as identity. Which way do we go? I mean, do we stick to our old affiliation, or we build a new relationship with the countries surrounding us?
It's not an either or. And we should also be grateful to America for our military alliance. The reality is the money that they spend on aircraft carriers is money we can spend on our health system. You know, but what I would also say though is that there is other areas other than this in foreign policy. I think we should be a lot more active. The Pacific, that is our neighbourhood. The fact that the French president had to remind the Australian Prime Minister, stick to your convictions on climate change. Climate change is a Pacific issue because they're the island communities of the Pacific. For them, it's not a theoretical debate. For them, it's rising sea levels, more extreme weather events. We need to focus on Indonesia, we need to focus on Papua New Guinea. Like, in our own region, we are very significant, and I think that we've tended to take our eye off the ball. So, you know, we look at Beijing, and we look at the Korean Peninsula, we look at Japan, we look at America. But there's a lot of good things we can do, not as a big brother in the region, but as a responsible family member to help make sure the rest of our neighbours are doing well. The more secure our neighbours are, the more secure we are.
Yes.
Definitely. I have a quick question to you, Bill. If you are elected Prime Minister, what would be your plan to strengthen the Air Force and the Navy to maintain our defence, especially in the northern shores?
We're committed to 2% of our GDP being expended on defence. I believe we should be building up, and Labor doesn't always get the credit, but we're the ones who said the submarines should be built in Australia, not overseas. And initially when we said it, everyone threw rocks at us and said we were silly. The government said Australia couldn't manufacture things. I have a vision of Australia developing greater independence in terms of, we'll never be totally independent, but I look at the debates around our lack of fuel refining capacity. You know, we're seeing short-term business decisions undermining long-term national interest. The lease of the Port of Darwin just done without a lot of analysis. Like, there's short-term decisions. So, defence manufacturing, yes. Allocating resources in our budget, yes. Making sure that our troops have the best equipment. I was in Afghanistan 7 days ago, visiting our troops. They're happy with the level of equipment. Our defence forces are very well regarded by NATO and coalition allies. But what we've got to keep doing is investing in manufacturing, investing in, you know, the best quality training. And again, though, our security is also derived from good relations with our near neighbours.
If we win the elections, basically it was around 7 years' time to build the airport, right? Budget Creek.
Yep.
We haven't seen them starting the constructions yet. And number two, you know very well, Bill, that by closing the airport in Sydney 6 hours a day, and already we're around 30 million passengers with the largest airport within the southern hemisphere. So, and we're losing a lot of business out of that. So I think this will help much.
We are supportive of
improving the
Badgerys
economy
Creek.
and all the real estate and the surrounding economy in New South Wales, and especially in that suburb.
We are supportive of Badgerys Creek, let me be very clear. my electorate's in the northwestern suburbs of Melbourne. So, by example, when Tullamarine was built, if you read the newspapers of the late 1960s, early 1970s, when it was built, they said it was too far out of Melbourne. Oh, it's silly now, of course it wasn't. So I think Badgerys Creek will grow into the job, but one lesson we learned out of the construction of Tullamarine is there's no public transport to it or through it. And it's a lot more expensive to retrofit. So I think one of the things which we think is important with Badgerys is an orbital railway link between the north and the south using the base of Badgerys Creek. So we're committed to it, but we're also committed to seeing it done right. And that way, as you know, and you know from logistics with engineering, it's always cheaper to put it in initially than retrofit. So we think that's an important part of what happens with the second airport. Sydney should have 2 airports.
I was going to ask you, I know you're running late, I was going to ask you about terrorism, moving, considering Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. What's your opinion about those 2 issues?
They're separate issues, of course.
Yeah, I know. I was going to ask you.
No, we
about
don't
this.
support moving the embassy. No, well, that's not going to help advance the cause of Middle Eastern peace. So I don't support moving the embassy to Jerusalem. That's also proof I can answer a question quickly. In terms of terrorism, yes, it's a threat, no doubt. We work with our security agencies. It's one of the unwritten stories of the last 5 years of Labor being in opposition, that there's been a high level of bipartisanship in terms of what we've had to do to strengthen our security laws to make sure that we have strong defence. But it's an ongoing problem, there's no question. Some of the foreign fighters returning, that will be a challenge. But also foreign fighters returning from the failed ISIS experiment into Southeast Asia, I think, is an ongoing challenge too.
Do you support them coming back, or?
I support us adhering to the law. I think they were foolish and wrong to go. I've got no sympathy for Australian citizens who fought for ISIS and who've perished in that conflict. No sympathy at all for them.
Yes.
I've got no sympathy for people who are trying to hurt our police officers or commit acts of terror on or above Australian soil. None at all.
Yes.
Australia will be as strong as the government on these matters.
Are we protected as a nation?
I don't think anyone can give a 100% guarantee. I mean, if someone's willing to give up their own life to cause harm, they're harder to stop. But having said that, I think our security agencies are doing a pretty good job.
Yes. I do agree.
But part of the way they do that is by working with the community. The best security for Australia are Australians. And it's isolating the extremists, it's making sure that vulnerable people aren't picked off by the manipulators.
Right.
The internet gives a whole new channel of dissemination for evil propaganda and manipulation. But on balance, I think our government, and I think governments of all political stripes, are trying to do everything they can. And this is where you use the example of the American alliance. You know, I do think we get valuable intelligence from other countries too.
We do get or we don't get?
We do.
Yeah.